Hey everyone, again, so good to be with you. I want to say again thank you to Sharm for that poem and for her thoughts this morning. That is such a great choice for a poem this morning to be read. The poem by Mary Oliver, When Death Comes. It seems an odd juxtaposition to put that next to the birth of Christ, this celebration of Christmas, and now we're talking about death. But what Mary Oliver says is that in life, when difficulty comes, when challenges come, even as death comes, what I want to be remembered for is that I was always married to amazement, that I was always seeking and being connected with wonder. I mean, that's the journey of faith, I think. And so even in a time like this, as Ross Gay would say, what better time to be thinking of delight, of finding delight, than in a time such as we find ourselves now. So that's what I want to think about with you this morning. A couple of takeaways, 3 lessons that we might take away, and a look back at some of our favorite music videos in the process. And I have to say right up front that this is not what anybody expected coming into 2020, right? I mean, if you look back in January at my first Sunday of the year, I mean, my theme was, how do we find a clear path? Because 2020, how do we find a clear path, a clear perspective in this divisive, polarized world? Well, none of us knew just how murky and how muddy and unclear and uncertain 2020 would be. And the chaos and the difficulty and the pain and the loss, it's been overwhelming for so many in so many different ways. You know, we always look forward to the Christmas card that the Jolin family sends out to a lot of us. And Brian and Jennifer and Thomas Jolin, who are members of 1111 and longtime members of the church, they always put out these great cards. This one this year, I think, just nailed it. So I want to show it to you. I mean, isn't that crazy? That's perfect. Does that not pretty well capture what we feel? But here's the thing that I want to, even as we feel that way, even as we feel, we wish we could just burn it all down. We wish we could just throw it out, have a do-over. The reality is, we have an invitation to take what we've learned and to continue to build into the reality of life's uncertainties, to move into 2021 with a greater sense of confidence, of trust, as we just got to talking about in the Advent series, a greater sense of confidence and hope in the future because of how we participate in it. So, one of the things that we've certainly picked up from this reality is that we are somehow all interconnected, that we cannot escape our interdependency with one another. I love that song, None of Us Are Free. It really speaks to this kind of reckoning that we are in, this invitation to recognize our interconnectedness with one another. Martin Luther King, when he spoke from the Birmingham jail, he wrote that letter. His letter from Birmingham jail was as much an address to his fellow white clergy sisters and brothers to come out and to speak in favor of this movement at the time, to recognize the common humanity and common shared destiny that everyone has, regardless of skin color, of race or creed or orientation for that matter. There's this shared common destiny that we continually having to reckon with. And when we don't reckon with it, things come apart at the seams, right? The way that Rumi, the 15th century mystic, Middle Eastern mystic, wrote, he said, out beyond ideas of right and wrong doing, there's a field, and that's where I'll meet you. How do we get past this binary? How do we recognize it's something bigger than that, it's something else? Remember that joke I used to tell? That it's the guy that goes into the bar, and he's new to the community, so he wants to kind of get an idea of who he's dealing with. And so he goes into the bar and just decides to throw it out there and get a sense of who these people are, what these people are like. So he says to everyone in the bar, he says, every last Democrat is a horse's butt. Well, the whole place mobs him. They grab him, they beat him up, and they throw him out in the street. And he brushes himself off. He's bruised and hurt, but now he smiles to himself because he says, all right, I know who I'm dealing with. So he goes in the next day, much more confident of who the people are. And he looks at the whole crowd and he laughs and he says, right, every last Republican is a horse's butt. And then to his surprise, the whole crowd mobs him again. They beat him up and they throw him out in the street. And now he's really confused. He's shaking himself and he brushes off the dust when he sees two guys coming out. And the tourist says, "Who are you people?" And the two guys say, "You don't get it, mister. This is horse country." Right. Out beyond ideas, there is a bigger picture. How do we get past binary ways of seeing things? Identity politics, polarization. It's become such an ingrained culture wars. It's all become such an ingrained part of our identity. It's like we are like Velcro. We're just connected to these ways of identifying ourselves as opposed to and against others. But Jesus, when he told his parables, he disrupted all of that. I mean, we did this series, Linda and I did this series at the beginning of all of this. I think it was called Disruptions, Parables, and Pandemics. And we looked at Jesus' parables. They weren't simply to disrupt the leadership, the priests and the Pharisees and the leadership of the temple, which often ostracized and marginalized and oppressed so many others within their own Jewish community and faith. It wasn't simply to disrupt that. It wasn't saying you're just wrong. It would often disrupt his listeners' viewpoints as well. Because his whole point was shalom is a process of being together, a common good, a common way of compassion and understanding and justice and right relationship with one another, God, and all of creation. How does that happen unless we can get out beyond ideas and right and wrong? So lesson one, then, that we might take away from 2020 and take into 2021. Lesson one might be that we will find more truth and more connective healing when we learn to reframe the conversations. When we learn to reframe them in a way that sees with wider perspectives, with more grace and mercy and more forgiveness. We're all in this together. When we can begin to recognize ways out beyond the binaries, then we begin to open up to the path to shalom. Those are two of my favorite videos of all the videos that Brad and the band have done. And they're so amazing. They're just in their distinctiveness and in what they capture in terms of the narrative of what we're dealing with right now and the hope of what we're dealing with. Brad was recently honored with a grant from the Resilience. Let's see, what's the name? It was Sounds of Resilience community, Sounds of Resilience organization, which honored maybe a dozen or 2 dozen musicians in our larger area who are exhibiting real creativity of resilience and improvisation and dealing with gig economies in a time of economic distress, really. And Brad has done that in a way that captures sort of the narrative of our time, especially with that video and so many of the others that we're seeing. So thanks so much for that, Brad, and congratulations on receiving that grant. Also, thanks so much to Joseph Veazey for joining us, the singer from Dallas, on that song Colors, which also captures where we are right now. The third lesson that I want to share with you really is this idea that came to mind from, I did a series called Peace in the Broken, Living in the Question, where I interviewed 6 people. And it was really inspired by Elizabeth's song, Peace in the Broken, which has this wonderful chorus line. It goes like this: there's peace in the broken, there's peace in the fall. And when your heart is open, it's not empty at all. That's the challenge, the idea I think that it speaks to is this third lesson, which is sometimes the places that break open for us, the places in which our lives are broken open, that is the place that opens the path for the next thing. The invitation is to move into that brokenness, right? To move into that with openness and with courage, and then to allow us to learn what the next best thing is. But the challenge with brokenness is back to the other idea, which is to retreat into this binary way of being, to align with our tribes or to find solace in others, but to kind of run from the anxiety, from the fear. And it is a challenge. It's very difficult to, when we are broken open, to face that openness, that vulnerability. But as many of the stories in our interviews had shown, that was the place where the real transformation began. And then when they look back on their own narratives and their own faith stories, where that being broken open really invited a much richer, a much more diverse, a much more open and merciful and graceful way of seeing and being and experiencing the world. The next song that Brad does is this song "Modern Love." What a beautiful song! And it really captures the messiness, right? Because the temptation is to idolize, pedestalize certain ideas like marriage, like love, like church, like God, to put them up there on sort of this pedestal where we can sort of worship them, and yet we're not really engaged with the messiness of them. And so Modern Love speaks to that messiness, but it does so with such a lively, danceable beat. And then to top that off, Brad does it dancing in the rain. And then it's followed by a song that's one of my favorite songs. Elizabeth Wills covers it by Alanis Morissette, and called "Thank You." How do we come to appreciate even the brokenness? What Rumi said, the guest house. This life is a guest house. Even when the bad things come, even when the meanness, even when the depression comes, invite them in, because they are opening us up to some new way of seeing. Elizabeth, thank you for that song. I don't know how you all feel about that. That's one of my favorite songs of the whole season. It just almost brings me to tears every time I see it and listen to it. And your voice, Elizabeth, it just carries that song so beautifully. But what I love about it is this idea that it segues so beautifully into my final lesson. Lesson number 3, takeaway from 2020 into 21. It's this idea that certainty is overrated. That in fact, maybe our practice, maybe our faith ought to be about how do we better cultivate uncertainty? In intentional ways, how do we cultivate the uncertainty that we live within? And I realize that goes against the grain for us neurologically, at least in terms of evolution. It goes against the grain because we're evolved to sort of protect ourselves, right? We're evolved to sort of seek predictability, to sort of seek a homeostasis, a comfort, a way of being in comfort most of the time. So we don't like things to be unfamiliar. We don't like things to be unpredictable. We like the predictability of life. And of course, 2020 has been anything but predictable. Linda and I go for walks every day now, and we especially like walking in unfamiliar places because they're unfamiliar, and we have to pay attention more in those places. You know, we have to kind of look around. It's more interesting, but we also have to pay attention to where we're walking. And we see new people, which is kind of fun because it broadens our sense of connectivity to be with these people we don't know. So one day we're walking, and it's getting kind of towards dusk, and we see this guy coming down the sidewalk on the other side of the street, and he starts to trip on a raised part of the sidewalk, which is what, you're always watching for in some of these older neighborhoods. And so the sidewalk catches him, but we were fascinated as we saw that he, in one fluid motion, as he caught his right foot on the sidewalk, his left foot leapt into the air, and then he just moved into a run, a sprint. And he ran for about 30 feet. It was really funny. He just kind of caught himself and started running for about 30 feet, and then went to walking again. As if the whole thing had been planned, as if he'd just been walking along and thinking, "Boo, I think I'll take a sprint." And then he sprinted and then stopped and continued to walk. We both laughed because of how quickly he was thinking on his feet, so to speak. But we also laughed because we started talking about this idea of what it's like to fall and how we don't like falling. Because falling throws us into this place of unpredictability. So we try to catch ourselves. We try to right the situation as best we can. So if we're going to fall, we try to catch ourselves on our feet. But we're thinking quick, and if we fall, we're going to try to at least catch our hands. It's instinctive. We put our hands out. But I thought we were thinking about it metaphorically too, because if we find ourselves falling all the time, sometimes the carpet literally being yanked out from under us, the rug being pulled out. But what we try to do is, in situations of complete unpredictability, we try to at least fall on our faith, or we try to at least fall on something that we think of as dependable. We fall on our tribe, on the communities that think like us. We fall there when things feel insecure, or we fall on a friend when we feel we feel thrown out of balance, thrown off balance by someone else, someone at work or something someone said to us. We feel jealous or we feel ashamed, and so we fall on a friend to try to feel right again, to try to feel a sense of balance, to try to feel okay. And I'm suggesting to you that certainty is overrated. But instead, the possibilities of what we can cultivate in uncertainty can bring us to a place of a deeper sense of spirituality, a deeper sense of wellness. If you read in the Psalms in 139, the psalmist says in 139, no matter where you fall, no matter how far you fall, no matter how deep you fall, no matter how much life falls apart around you, the sacred, we are embraced within the sacred, and the sacred within us. We are indistinguishable from the reality of the divine, the Imago Dei, the sacred God, whatever label you want to put on it. We rest in this reality, even in uncertainty. And it made me think of the creation story where God creates the earth, the world in 7 days or 6 days and rests on the seventh. And of course, we always think of it as now it's kind of a silly mythical story, or as I like to say, a make-believe story. It's a profound myth, though. And looking back at it, I realize there's something else going on there that I missed. And I'm seeing it now through these eyes, through this filter of uncertainty, through this, what I want to now call my 2020 vision of uncertainty. I like the irony of that. And as I look at that, I realize that story is about something else completely different. The creation story begins in uncertainty. And all of these things for 6 days are created out of uncertainty. The possibilities that are there when we find ourselves in this broken open, in this confusing and chaotic place. Out of this chaotic stuff comes something good, as the story says. And on the seventh day, God rests. And I'm thinking, God doesn't need a nap. What's the rest all about? And then it occurred to me, the rest is the place we find ourselves in when we have let go of the need for certainty and instead have found the motivation and the desire to create in times of uncertainty. That's what we are invited into. And I think that's what 2020 invites us to take into 2021. To let go of the need for certainty and to begin to practice this way of being amazed, of finding delight. One other quick little image. Some months ago, I started taking leftover cat food because that was left in the cat's bowl at night. And I just started throwing it out into the far part of the yard because the raccoons and the possums were coming up and tearing up the porch and getting into the cat food. So if there was any left over, I just threw it to the farthest part of the yard. Well, one morning I was working on the porch and I noticed a couple of women walking their dogs. And as their dogs were coming toward each other, about 10 feet away, they were out there by that further part of the yard. And the dogs started pulling at the chain toward each other, kind of growling. And you could see it concerned the two women, and they didn't know whether to just walk across the street or whatever. But in that instant, both dogs must have picked up the scent of the cat food in the grass. And they both turned and went toward the grass and started nibbling and rooting to find the delight, so to speak. And as they enjoyed their findings, the two women found it more an opportunity to talk with each other for a moment and laughed about the whole thing. And what was surprising is that after the dogs got filled with that, they were finished with that. They just passed each other. They just walked on past each other. That initial sense of aggressiveness that was inborn in them, that's a part of their biology, right? That had been sidestepped by delight. What an interesting idea. I think that's what God is. I think God is delight. Always waiting in every moment, and especially in times of uncertainty, inviting us to create out of those moments. And as Mary Oliver would say, then to start telling people about it. I hope you have a beautiful new year, and so good to be with you again. We've got 2 amazing songs coming up to close us out. I look forward to seeing you in the near future.